Christ is not king. I'd like to leave it at that because I'd like to believe Christians, of all people, would fully understand that statement. But they are the ones making this ridiculous claim. Now it's become the most controversial thing to proclaim, proving somehow that by making this declaration, you are anti tiny nation people. While I don't want to argue with people about what they believe, because I feel it's important that everyone has the right to think, feel, or believe what they want without condemnation or insults, I can state the obvious about those people without claiming they're racists. But this idea of Christ as king has somehow turned into the worst kind of racism the world has ever seen. Why? Because it negates one group's claim to something. It is telling that group of people they are better than the other group of people, all who are vying for the same God's coveted, chosen spot. Here we have a war of words and favoritism. This is like your younger sibling constantly telling you that your parents don't love you because he or she is the chosen heir, an obvious favorite for doing all the right things you didn't do. You failed at being a good child. Therefore, you're not as good as your sibling and deserve to be cast aside. Many of us have faced that very type of reality. Your parents made it clear who their favorite was or still is, and your sibling constantly shoves it in your face. I'm the favorite, you're not. Sounds childish because it is. A lot of people seem to think Candace Owens coined this phrase that Christ is king, but it really stems from Nick Fuentes, who is framed as a white nationalist. Now, as I was digging into this topic online, this statement was described as a highly charged, weaponized political slogan co-opted by extreme far-right and white nationalist figures. I found this statement to be yet another internet distortion of truth because Candace and her followers, who are obviously not white nationalists, say it every single day. Candace even sells merch exclaiming Christ is king. Nearly every comment contains the phrase as a way to say, hey, I'm in this gang, not the other gang. So let's get past this idea that it's a white nationalist battle cry. Was it a battle cry, though? Not by a white nationalist, but by a woman who was publicly stoned by her then boss, Ben Shapiro, an obvious Mossad Israeli asset. Sorry, I mean conservative podcaster. Her crime was stating the obvious. Genocide was being committed in Palestine, and as a Christian, she could no longer support a group of people doing the slaughtering as the world turned a blind eye. Her whole life was then dismantled for her statement, Christ is king. She was put on full display for the whole world to watch that any comments like this and your life will be destroyed. So who was right then? Candace or Ben? That was the online drama that still has life in one form or another today. And because it became an us versus them statement, it has become a battle cry for Christians against Zionism. We are the chosen ones, not you. You denied your Messiah and we accepted him, whereas you killed him. That's not my claim. That's the central message of this statement. However, it's not the message I'm going to focus on today, not in the political context. Instead, I want to dissect this from a scriptural point of view. Christ is not king, was never king, and will never be king. He never wanted to be king or be seen as a king. He came for something much more meaningful than that. According to Hebrew tradition, the Mashiach, or Messiah, is simply a human leader from the line of David. He's expected to bring world peace, rebuild the temple, and bring everyone back home. But from a Jewish point of view, Jesus didn't check those physical boxes or meet those earthly requirements at all. And they still viewed Jesus as a heretic to their religion, unworthy of any recognition at all. So, how then did Jesus become the Son of their God? That's a good question. Let's peel back the layers of this curse, shall we? The Hebrew texts are absolutely rigid regarding one specific requirement. Their Messiah has to be a literal, flesh and blood heir from David's bloodline, passed down through the Father. This presented a massive hurdle for the gospel authors who were simultaneously trying to sell the narrative that Jesus was the product of a virgin birth and the Holy Spirit's intervention. In an attempt to jam this square peg into a round hole, Matthew and Luke went in completely opposite directions, dreaming up family trees that scholars are still trying to reconcile today. Matthew's gospel targets a Hebrew audience from the jump, opening with a family tree meant to establish some sort of legitimacy. He maps out a line from Abraham through David, eventually landing on Joseph. But there is a massive problem with this narrative. If Joseph isn't the biological father, the bloodline is broken. So, to fix this, Matthew pivots to a legal loophole, claiming that raising a child confers legal status. He's essentially trying to manufacture a legal claim to David's throne for Jesus, even though it bypasses the literal blood requirement entirely. Luke, however, opts for an entirely separate path, drafting a lineage that stretches all the way to Adam in an attempt to market Jesus to the whole of humanity rather than just the Hebrew population. There is a desperate theological theory that Luke is actually mapping the maternal side through Mary to force a biological link to David, despite the fact that the actual scripture is famously vague on that matter. The authors of the gospel leaned heavily on a traditional Jewish interpretive method known as midrash. They effectively cherry-picked fragments, historical accounts, or ancient poetry from the Hebrew texts, stripping them of their intended setting just to proclaim this was actually a secret prophecy about Jesus. Turning back to the Hebrew source, we find the prophet Isaiah addressing King Ahaz regarding a pressing military threat. In Isaiah 7:14, he uses the term Alma while referring to a nearby pregnant woman. Alma is defined as a young woman of age, not a literal virgin. This metaphor was addressing the point that prior to her child reaching the age of discernment, the opposing monarchs would face certain defeat. But the plot thickens during the translation of the Hebrew text into the Greek Septuagint, where the term Alma was swapped for Parthenos, a word that explicitly denotes a virgin. Matthew pounced on this Greek variation, using it as a convenient anchor to validate the narrative of a supernatural birth. He essentially rewrote Isaiah's message as a secret prophecy aimed at an event 7 centuries in the future, which was literally the past, cleverly creating a puzzle of pieces that didn't quite fit. You think they do, but I'll show you how they don't. The original disciples, who were themselves deeply rooted in Hebrew culture, collided with the harsh truth. Jesus' public humiliation and slaughter concluded that Jesus failed the Messiah test. In a desperate attempt to debunk the established religious authorities, the authors of the New Testament didn't discard the ancient scrolls. Instead, they aggressively hijacked and overhauled their entire meaning. They deployed a mix of cherry picked bloodlines, linguistic gymnastics, and a radical rebranding of physical promises into mystical ones to manufacture their narrative. Because Jesus was tortured and slaughtered like a common thief, those steeped in Deuteronomy viewed this public execution as the ultimate proof of failure. As being hung on a tree signaled that you were literally cursed by their God. The New Testament writers had a hurdle ahead of themselves and decided to create a spiritual hazard of the job. The authors hijacked passages such as Isaiah 53, which, in its original context, depicted the collective suffering of Israel among the Gentiles, and rebranded them as a secret blueprint for a suffering Messiah. The narrative shifted to claim that the Hebrew authorities simply failed to decipher a concealed mystical schedule. These authors effectively weaponized the Greek variations of ancient texts against the established Hebrew authorities, boldly claiming that the very scholars who guarded those scrolls were incapable of deciphering their own sacred writings. But what if I told you that even this story isn't true? Yeshua's original followers were gritty Aramaic tongue laborers from Galilee. There's no way they wrote those gospels. It was the early church establishment that later attached the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to nameless Greek scripts, a tactical move to manufacture apostolic clout. The far more explosive revelation lies within the fundamental theology itself. Historical clues point toward the original collective, spearheaded by Jesus's biological brother, James the Just, as Jesus referred to him in the Nag Hammadi texts, alongside Peter, holding a perspective of Jesus that stands in stark contrast to the Christianity we know. They didn't perceive some celestial, pre incarnate deity of a monarch perishing for universal transgressions. He was a messenger, a mere human, signaling that the kingdom of their God was about to materialize right here on earth within them. When modern scholars try to peel back the layers of the New Testament to find out what the actual historical disciples believed, they look at the earliest layers of the text from a lost document called Q, from the German word Quell, meaning source. The Q source consists of the earliest sayings of Jesus, shared by his direct followers before the theological spin was added. They discovered that Jesus wasn't walking around demanding people worship him, and he wasn't talking about a virgin birth. He is acting exactly like an ancient Jewish prophet. To the original disciples, Jesus was the ultimate messenger of a cosmic shift outside of external religion and into internal power. After the crucifixion, the original followers of Yeshua formed the Jerusalem church, led by James. They didn't call themselves Christians. They were known as the Nazarenes, and later, the Ebionites, meaning the poor ones. They clung to the conviction that Jesus was a literal human, the natural offspring of Joseph and Mary. In their view, he wasn't divine by birth, but rather a man handpicked by their God to serve as a messenger solely because of his unmatched personal righteousness. Now, I see it differently, but this isn't about what I think. This is merely the evidence provided to us through countless scholars who've studied the Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as the Nag Hammadi texts. If you're interested in my thoughts, let me know in the comments below. I might do a video on what I believe was revealed to me a few months ago and journaled about in great detail. These followers still adhered to the strict Jewish laws. And this is where we find Paul and Peter debating these topics and vehemently disagreeing to the point of a public breakup. They viewed Paul as a dangerous heretic and false prophet who was bastardizing Yeshua's message to appeal to the pagans. Unlike Peter and the gang, Paul never met the living Jesus. He had a vision on the road to Damascus, and based on that internal experience, completely bypassed the actual disciples. Paul took the human messenger and turned him into a cosmic, mystical deity. I explained this in a previous video, how many of us receive and experience this incredible awakening, but it somehow gets hijacked into religion. Paul is the one who invented this soul snatching, taking away the true beauty of the Christ consciousness. Paul insisted that Jesus' sacrificial death was the only thing that saved you. In Galatians, Paul boasts about screaming in Peter's face and mocks the Jerusalem leadership of James, Jesus' own brother and appointed by Jesus as his successor, Peter and John as mere so-called pillars who added nothing to him. Sounds exactly right. Really shows love, harmony, and unity. I guess we can pinpoint Paul's obnoxious ego to the reality of constant religious conflicts. So if Jesus was simply a messenger, flesh and blood, just like you and I, how did we get tangled up in the supernatural cosmic king theory? The original Jesus movement contradicted Paul's religious warfare, which eventually led to the brutal death of Jesus' true message and those who practiced it. Paul's convoluted, self-glorifying script was all that survived across the Roman Empire. The Greek-speaking authors compiling the New Testament decades later only had Paul's account. In their Greek drama, they retroactively cast the original disciples as dense, confused men who just didn't understand Jesus' true divine identity. The very concept of Jesus as a universal cosmic monarch is a Hellenized Greek Roman invention that completely overwrote the actual historical message. The people who walked with him would likely look at modern Christian dogmas and not even recognize the man they followed. Jesus wouldn't recognize it either. First of all, Jesus' last name wasn't Christ. He wasn't Christ the Messiah of the Jews. That word didn't exist for them. They believed in Mashiach, or anointed one. The Greek authors again replaced this word to Christos, the root verb kreo, meaning to smear, rub, or plaster. It was a mechanical description of applying a substance to a surface. If you rub medicinal salve onto a wound, you were Christosing it. If you smeared whitewash plaster onto a stone wall to seal it, that wall was Christos. It lacked any connotation of a divine, world-saving king. It was simply the state of being smeared. The Hebrew Mashiach was chosen by God to perform an earthly duty as a human king or military liberator, a rebellious political takeover. To the Hebrews, in their own texts, they don't have just one Messiah. King Saul and King David were messiahs. They even viewed Cyrus, a pagan Persian emperor, as God's direct Messiah, setting the Jews free from Babylon. None of these messiahs saved anyone from sin. They were geopolitical tools. Because the Greek world had zero context for the Hebrew political concept of a Mashiach, Paul took the Greek translation Christos and detached it from its Jewish political roots entirely. He transformed Christ from a job description into a metaphysical state of being. But let's not take Paul's words or even the original followers' accounts of this so-called kingship and go directly to the source, Yeshua.
My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world. You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth.
Jesus' standard response is a cryptic Aramaic idiom, sue pas or suleges, which translates literally to you say so or those are your words. He refuses to self-identify with the rigid military definition of kingship everyone was obsessed with and is obviously still obsessed with. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. John 6:15. Jesus didn't lean into this notion of him being king on earth or anywhere else in the universe for that matter. He ran from it. He rejected it wholeheartedly. He explicitly told his followers that his version of leadership looked like the exact opposite of a king. Today's aggressive political movement has weaponized the slogan, Christ is King, to demand cultural supremacy and flex their authority over perceived enemies. Yet, when we return to the source, Yeshua defined his leadership through absolute non-coercion and a total refusal to engage in earthly power plays. He explicitly commanded a life of service over ruling. Jesus vehemently rejected and actively fled from this geopolitical kingdom, claiming it was harmful to all of humanity. So while Jesus made it very clear he was not king and didn't want the role of a king, Christians continue to force the crown on his head. They are the Romans beating him down, twisting his words, and forcefully smashing the bloody throne back into his skull all over again. They are the ones placing the King of the Jews plaque over his head on the cross and then worshiping it. Jesus didn't come to be worshiped. He didn't even come to be immortalized. He was far from a king on earth and would reject the notion of a kingship in any other cosmic realm. He connected to the higher consciousness of the Echad, the unity of the collective consciousness that the Lemurians held in divine unity, harmony, and balance. This was not a kingdom, but a mindset. It was Paul's cult that would rewrite history, making the sacrifice necessary and the cross its symbol of divine suffering we should all endure with glee. Christ is not king. He said so himself. Your support is greatly appreciated. So please make sure to subscribe and comment below. I do respond to everyone except for those that I have to delete. You know who you are. I see a lot of you watching my videos and you haven't subscribed yet. What are you waiting for? It's time to reverse that curse because you deserve to be free.